All right. So on behalf of the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force conveners, who are Nicole Bernard of Shield, North Carolina, Pam Strickland of NC Stop Human Trafficking, and Fran Journey of Legacy of Hope, and myself, I'd like to welcome you all to the fourth and final installment of the Demand Reduction webinar series. In the first webinar, we discussed why demand reduction was a necessary component of anti-trafficking efforts and described the mission, goals, and teams of the Demand Reduction Task Force. In the second session, we listened to survivors describe demand reduction from their perspective. In our third session, we heard from a former buyer and from a sex trafficking survivor who just happened to be married. And we were encouraged by each of their stories of restoration. And finally, today, we are putting it all together and hearing from national experts on successful strategies and considerations used to develop an effective demand reduction approach. So I know you are as excited as I am to learn from these very knowledgeable and experienced panelists today. So let's get started with some introductions. All right, since 2012, Nick Lembo has been involved in standing against human trafficking with various organizations, including Shared Hope International. He is currently serving as a board member for the Arizona Anti-Trafficking Network. Nick is also a statewide coordinator for Just Men Arizona, where he recruits men as volunteers to engage buyers to disrupt demand. Next, Michael Shively is a senior advisor on research and policy at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. He has had over a 30-year career in applied research, and for 20 years, he has led research on the perpetration, victimization, and system responses to both survivors and offenders in human trafficking. He founded and currently directs Demand Forum, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. It's a website documenting demand reduction tactics. It's used in more than 2,500 communities throughout the US. Last but not least, Peter Qualliotine. He's been working to promote men's accountability and to end commercial sexual exploitation for more than 30 years and created one of the first sex buyer intervention programs. He also co-founded an organization for prostitution survivors and launched a 10-week sex buyer intervention program through that organization. Presently, Peter coordinates Modeling Equality, a project to catalyze the creation and implementation of policies that address commercial sexual exploitation through an equity model framework. So unfortunately, Dr. Stephanie Powell is under the weather and is not able to join us today. So we hope she'll be feeling better soon. Our panelists today each have an impressive list of accomplishments and years of demand-related experience. There's no way I could do them justice in this quick introduction. So in a little bit, I will put the link of to their bios in the chat so you guys can read more about them. So, gentlemen, let's get started. Tell us a little bit about how you got involved in demand reduction. I think you are muted, Michael. There you go.
Yeah, I was just asking, who do you want to start with?
We can start with you.
You know, that's a question I ask myself. How did I get here? And it's actually like a serious answer. You know, I mean, it's a serious question. I sort of figured it out later. I just found myself drawn to a set of topics from when I was a student in graduate school, and we had to pick things to do term papers on. And I think it's pretty clearly traceable to the fact that by the time I graduated from high school, at least 3 of the girls or young women that I went to school with had been sexually assaulted. And it just made an impression on me. I just couldn't figure out how that could happen. And, you know, I didn't decide to go into this, you know, as a career, but, you know, years later, I just kept coming back to it. So throughout a career in research, I'm very much an applied researcher. I've not really been that interested in academic research for its own sake. You know, I want to find out how things work and how to improve things and how to stop problems and how to improve problems. So I was always drawn to the offender. And so in sexual violence, intimate partner violence, I was always looking at the perpetrator. And when I started doing work on human trafficking, I was always drawn to what I think is the core driver of it, which is the consumers, the buyers that create the market for all sex trafficking and prostitution. So yeah, just keep coming back to it. And it's been a passion of mine to try to figure it out and try to, make some sort of improvement in the situation we find ourselves in. I will stop there.
All right, Nick, you want to go next?
Sure. Well, about 10 years ago, my wife started getting interested in fighting trafficking. And when she asked me to go to meetings with her, I would always ask who's going to be there. And 10 years ago, at least my experience was, it was mostly women. And I was like, well, I don't belong there. And I kind of fit the demographic of the buyers from what I understood, So it was like, why do I want to go? I'm not law enforcement. I'm not a judge. I'm not a lawyer. But I went and I heard one meeting, and it was a gentleman from LexisNexis, and he was talking about fighting demand. And I had never heard of that. I didn't know anything about trafficking. I kind of joked today, they were talking about law cases against John. And I was thinking, who is John? And every time they mentioned John, all these ladies got really angry. And I thought, man, if they ever find him, he is in a lot of trouble, But I did figure it out. But I went up to the speaker and I said, look, he was talking about getting to men. And I thought my experience is men need to get to men. And so I asked him about different groups. He talked about Shared Hope and the Defenders. And so I got involved in that. But I was I wanted something where I could really kind of get involved more than just talking about it. And so with some friends of ours and others, started doing what we call these cyber patrols, which we interact with the buyers at the point of sale and have very interesting discussions. So, I find it interesting because I know Peter and I knew his work. We used to live up in Seattle, and I, get to work with the buyers before they get to him. So, it's interesting because for me, it was working with other groups. I was a founding member of the Rebecca Bender Initiative and getting to know Rebecca and all the different survivors and hearing their stories. They would just tell me interesting stories about these men, obviously some very violent, but then some very interesting, and conversations they would even have. And Rebecca was always encouraging me, she said, you need to get involved. You need to find a way to talk to these guys. And these are some of the things that, I learned in my experience in finding maybe what could get to them. So that's kind of what really got to it. I think knowing a lot of the survivors and hearing their stories, and wanting a way to really interact with these guys before it's too late for them.
So I'm Peter Qualliotine, and I've been involved in this issue, the issue of commercial sexual exploitation, and specifically men's accountability and ending it, for just over 30 years. And I got started not knowing that this is what I was going to be doing. Certainly, like Michael, in a way, I was primarily interested in other forms of gender-based violence before I really understood this one. And I got involved in that because I grew up in a domestic violence household and recognized really early on that although my father's violence became a problem for my mom and my siblings and myself, that it was really his problem. It was his inability to deal with his frustration, anxiety, perceived criticism, and his feelings of entitlement to take it out sideways on the people around him, on the people who loved him and the people who he loved. And as I got older, I saw that it wasn't just my house, but it was many houses that this type of violence was happening. And although most men don't do these types of things, when these types of things are done, they're mostly done by men. When I started to learn about sexual assault and sexual harassment, I started connecting the dots and recognizing that these too were forms of gender-based violence and exploitation that were predominantly perpetrated by men. And as a result of that understanding, I started to do prevention work in partnership with women's service organizations in Portland, Oregon. And if I could travel back in time and ask that younger self, well, why aren't you talking about prostitution? I would look at myself from the future and say, what are you talking about? What does that have to do with anything? That's like, I thought of it as something entirely different. I didn't put it in the silo of other forms of gender-based violence. It was off here somewhere else. Probably, I thought it should be legalized and regulated, and that should be the end of it. But there was a remarkable group in Portland, Oregon at that time called Council for Prostitution Alternatives. And they were a group that was founded by women who had been in the life and then got out and formed this organization to help others exit. And when I started to meet these women and hear their stories, it turned my head around 180 degrees. You know, because they were adults when I met them, but most of them got involved in prostitution when they were teenagers. They'd experienced emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect at home, ran away from home, got taken away from home to escape that abuse, and were vulnerable by manipulation by significantly older men, pimps who used these forms of violence to control them. And I started to recognize that this too was consistent with other forms of gender-based violence. And so I started to focus on what can we do to engage men and boys to stop gender-based violence, but specifically commercial sexual exploitation. And in the mid-90s, I started the Sexual Exploitation Education Project, or SEEP, which lasted for a few years, and probably in no small part because of the acronym, just terrible. But we started one of the early John School programs in the country. And fast forward, 20 years after that, I'd worked with survivors, adults and youth, worked more with buyers, worked more with prevention, and eventually landed in Seattle and co-founded the Organization for Prostitution Survivors with Noel Gomez. And it was through there that we, in a unique partnership that was funded by Demand Abolition, we were one of the first 4 CEAS network cities and had the opportunity to work in partnership with the prosecuting attorney's office and create a new model of not necessarily a new model, definitely a new model of buyer's intervention, but a new strategy for kind of tackling the issue of commercial sexual exploitation in a holistic way, which meant having exit programming for adults and youth. It meant changing the norms that were at the root of the practice and engaging men and boys along a spectrum of prevention, right? And so those were the 3 legs of our stool that we sat upon to address commercial sexual exploitation. And we thought about it as kind of putting the equality model into practice. What does it mean to operationalize the equality model? And so demand reduction was a really important focus for us, and especially important that it be integrated with the other 2 legs of the stool, the norms change and the exits programming pieces of it, so that it worked together in a coordinated community response to the issue. So in the past few years since I left Seattle, I've been doing consulting with communities and groups around the country to kind of advise how to bring stakeholders together in order to develop coordinated community responses to sexual exploitation. And I believe, like you all do, that the demand reduction is an essential part of those strategies.
I think it's interesting. You guys all come from kind of a different approach, a different background. I'd be interested to know what you have learned from who buyers are and what drives their behavior. So Michael, you guys are being too shy. I'm just gonna start calling on you.
This is where I say to myself, what would Peter say? I've been looking up to his understanding of who the buyers are for years. And I don't know, I think he probably has, the most experience dealing one-on-one with them, probably knows them better. But from my point of view as kind of a researcher and looking at it from the point of view of those who are trying to intervene, those who are actually trying to implement all kinds of programs, including police. I've spent a lot of time with police, and I think their perspective is interesting too. So I'll try to channel that as much as I can. But I think that one answer to the question, who are the buyers, is that they're more than one thing. They're not a monolithic group. They're not driven by just one thing. It's not all about sex. And broad generalizations are pretty fraught with danger when you talk about them. So I think it's very important to understand that they're very diverse. This isn't something that we don't know much about. There is a lot that is known about buyers, both from the clinical and the qualitative to a lot of surveys in all kinds of different populations. And we know that they can be placed in basic kinds of groups. Like, some of them are, really would love to have a relationship or a girlfriend or a wife, and they just aren't getting it done. So they resort to the fake version of it, the girlfriend experience. There's a mirror image sort of guy that really doesn't want a girlfriend or a wife. He doesn't want the person. He doesn't want a human. What he wants is sex without any of the other parts of a person. And so it's almost like an opposite sort of character. Some people, maybe you could call them thrill seekers or variety seekers, like they are extreme objectifiers, and they see people as these things they want to acquire or sample. Like, they want a certain race today, a certain size, a certain appearance, a certain type. And, they're really not looking for a human. And then there's another group, you can keep slicing and dicing and unpacking like the types of motivations or traits that the guys have, but the type that we worry a lot about are the ones that really can be put into a pathology group. The misogynists, the sociopaths, the psychopaths, the people who really want to do harm, or they can't help themselves from doing harm, or they don't even have the ability to recognize that they're committing harm. There's a bunch of groups there that we could talk about, but I think laying over all of them, I think the one thing that's actually necessary for any of them to move forward and buy sex is entitlement. Peter brought that word up, and all of these guys need to feel that it's allowed. They need to feel it's okay to do it. And that's where we really get into a big discussion about culture and norms and very broad themes. It isn't just that these guys have a broken circuit in their head, or that they just grew up in some extreme place. There's a lot of social support that really does a lot of signaling to a lot of men that it's really okay, including the industry itself. And the industry itself is always pushing the message that this, other than rare exceptions, they will say, it's the exact opposite of true, but what they say is the rare exception, of course, we don't want, which is trafficking. But other than that, it's consenting adult sexual behavior, and we should just let it go. So those signals are really strong right now. I mean, I think the drumbeat is louder than it's ever been in our country, and public polling is starting to really tip over 50%. And 5 years ago, you couldn't find a public servant, an elected official, that would go on the record and say they wanted to decriminalize prostitution. In the last 5 years, we've had at least 7 states introduce bills, and we've had over 100 candidates run on it and declare that's where they're going. So when you have that, and then there's all the online stuff we could talk about too, which is OnlyFans and the whole online sex thing. It's really blurring a lot of lines. Is it pornography? Is it prostitution? There's interactive virtual sexual things happening. And the normalization is just at hyperspeed, right? The normalization of the sex trade. So I think you can take a fairly decent guy, and it doesn't take a broken person or a pathology to get a person into the position where they think it's fine to have sex. And this is not victim blaming, but it can easily sound like it, to say that the people that they are encountering reinforce every wrong idea they have. For the most part, they say, you're my guy, you're my boyfriend, I like being with you, yeah, I want to be here, I choose to be here. It doesn't matter what the reality is. They could have a quota and a violent pimp, or they could be desperate, or all kinds of things that make that false, but they need to say it in order to survive by selling. And so there's a lot of stuff coming at men, and it's not to let them off the hook, because I think I think, at some point, people need to be accountable. And, the other panelists, I'm sure, can talk about this far better than I have. But, at some point, there has to be something that says, wait a second, when I was a teenager, I got approached by women on the streets, and there was something, even as a pretty stupid teenager, that just said, man, I don't think she's telling the truth. I don't think she wants to do this. And there was just something wrong. Yeah, I felt it. Now, I don't think I'm a, unusually wonderful person or anything. I just think that the majority of people do have that sort of alarm that goes off. They smell something wrong about the whole thing. And from what we know, that more than 80% of men probably never, ever do this. So, it's not inevitable. It's not universal. But we can talk about the men and what may or may not be wrong with individual people, but we also got to look at the culture and where we're headed and the sort of signals that are really strong right now. So I'll turn it over to them. I think they have much more to say about it.
I can go next, and I really liked what the things you were saying, Michael, and I think it is, while they're not a homogenous group, I think that there's certain things that I look at with buyers in order to kind of create programming for them, right? To kind of figure out what are some of those commonalities. And what I've seen is that they're predominantly men that buy sex, even when it's a boy or a trans person or a non-binary person who's being bought. It's usually a man who's doing the purchasing, even more so than when we're looking at domestic intimate partner violence or at sexual assault or sexual harassment. And so it's a form of gender-based violence. So they're men, and then they feel entitled to pay for sex. I think that entitlement piece is key. And then really taking it from there, I think that there's two quotes that I often refer back to that I've heard from buyers over the years when I've asked them if they had any insight into why they bought sex. And the first one was a guy who was pretty honest when he answered, I buy sex because the only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection. The only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection. And so, you can look at that and you can say, oh, well, this is like a person who's afraid or shy or whatever. It's also about power and control, right? It's about I want to control this so that you don't have the power to actually say what you are going to do in this situation and say no to me. I want it my way or no way, right? The other quote that I have is from a guy who said a similar thing in a different way, and he said, "I buy sex because I love sex, but I hate women. I love sex, but I hate women." When I asked him, why do you say that? Why do you say you love sex, but you hate women? He answered that, well, I hate women because I was married to one of them for 15 years, one of them, right? And then she left me and took half of everything I have. So I'm never going to trust another one of them again, right? So rather than kind of heal, to me, I saw him and said, whoa, he's hurt. he felt betrayed. He needs to grieve, he needs to be able to deal with these feelings. But rather than being able to process that stuff, it was easier for him to amplify and project his anger onto a whole class of half of humanity, right? I'm not going to have a real relationship with a woman because they hurt me. And so I'm just going to buy sex from now on. The only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection. Right. And so I think that's where kind of, I think many men who buy sex, the commonality is in that link. And then, they're really variable, but I think we can look at the practice on a continuum, right? That some of being the most overt, harmful sort of stuff, like out in King County where Nick and I were, we had the Green River Killer. And he targeted women in prostitution, girls in prostitution, for murdering, because he said he could kill as many as he wanted without getting caught. And he did for many years. And that's one end of the continuum. But there's a whole nother end of the continuum of buyers. Like I had a guy call in Seattle once who wanted to self-refer to the intervention program. And so when I met with him to talk about entering the class, he said, from the beginning, Peter, I just want to let you know I'm a good John. Said, I've never hurt any of the girls physically. I've never hurt them emotionally. And then he stopped himself and said, well, you know, I'm really not sure if I hurt them emotionally or not, because when you look in their eyes, it's like they're not even there. It's like they're wearing a mask or something. And to me, you know, I asked him, you know, what part of this other person being dissociative told you that it was a great idea to go ahead and have sex with them? And his answer was, well, I paid. And I asked him if he would do that with somebody he didn't pay, and he said, of course not. You know, that there was this sort of dichotomy operative in his mind that's a cultural one, that's going to require cultural change and a real norm shift, where there's this good girl, bad girl dichotomy, right? Where we have these categories of archetypes of girl or woman that have to do with either being a good girl or being a bad girl. And the bad girl archetype is the prostituted woman, right? And oftentimes when victim blaming happens to people of other forms of gender-based violence, not just prostitution, that victim blaming tends to be rooted in this bad girl archetype, something to hold her responsible. Just think of the questions that get asked when somebody's been sexually assaulted and is being blamed for the violence that's happened to them. What are the questions? The questions have to do with, what's your sexual history? Were you drinking? What were you wearing? You know, the question is really, were you a slut? Were you a whore? Did you bring this upon yourself because of your conduct as a fallen woman who's going to lead men astray, good men astray, right? And that's I think where we really need to kind of change the understanding of what it means to be in relationship with one another, and how do we undo generation after generation of men's violence, you know, against women, certainly against prostituted women especially, but against one another as well. Right. And I think a lot of it has to do with working with buyers as well, is really helping to kind of like deconstruct the toxic or hegemonic modes of masculinity that we've learned to embody over time, that don't serve us and don't serve our families and don't serve our communities anymore. And we need to get rid of the industries that support those identities as well. And we need to kind of invite men into real alternatives, right? That are rooted in respect for others, with mutual aid, with sharing, with collaboration, with and reject these modes of dominance and that are rooted in fear. And are essential to this identification with toxic or hegemonic modes of masculinity. So kind of in broad strokes, that's how I look at the work of working with buyers and the steps that I think they need to walk through in terms of understanding why they do what they do, because they're not the best people to report on it in the beginning, right? Their report is, why do I buy sex? Because I'm horny. And it's like, well, we need to deconstruct horny. Like, we need to take it apart and look at where it comes from in your personal history. We need to look at where it comes from societally. We need to look at where it came from the night that you got caught in this thing. Like, where did that episode start? Yesterday or six weeks ago, or however long that is. So it's both kind of an individual journey to take with individual buyers, and it is a social practice that has some commonalities around hegemonic modes of masculinity.
Yeah, I'll jump in and try not to repeat everything that's been said. Totally agree with all the different demographics of the buyers. Just to let people know, what I do is we have teams that we post decoy ads on websites that men are frequenting in order to buy. So we have conversations, most through text, some through phone calls. So been going almost 6 years I've been doing this. So literally I've had couple of thousand conversations with buyers. And one thing I want to highlight is something Michael said, is what I've noticed in the last 2 years particularly is the arguments we're getting from men about these women have a right to make a living. And that is very, very different than when we first started. That didn't really come up a whole lot, but very, very much so are we getting the pushback and arguments that these women are allowed to make a living. And so, depending on where we are, a lot of stories, but, we'll push back and just try to speak some common sense. If we can find some humanity in this individual, and some are, like Michael said, sociopaths, broken men, we can't, get anywhere with them. But if we can have a conversation with them, we start pushing back at just some common sense things like, there are HR laws. And, if you've worked in corporations, how many times there were HR meetings that, they taught on sexual harassment. And so now we have an occupation where sexual harassment is the norm. That's part of the job description. If you want to make a job description for these individuals, it's sexual harassment. You get to do whatever you want. What work environment is like that? And so we try to, talk to them about that. And, studies we've looked at, the mortality rate of these individuals that are caught in this is like 200% higher than any other norm for women, particularly. So how can you say this is a job that somebody wants to do? I love what Peter said. He was at a meeting here in Arizona, asking a group of Johns and John School, they're saying, well, these women are choosing this. And he said, I have to give him credit because he's on this. If Peter, if you weren't on here, I'd tell everyone it's my story, but no, I'm kidding. But no, I loved what he said. He said, did you want to be here at this John School today? And it was like, you had no options. The circumstances of life had pushed you into this. So that's when we start talking to, these individuals that, 63%, again, we're looking at studies we've got of women in this world experience rape. So what kind of a job is this? But I think that's the thing that has me most concerned now, the amount of money that's being put into this, as Michael said, the legislation to legalize this. And obviously that's not the topic here, but that's what I'm fighting with individuals first and foremost. And again, all the stories of, yes, there are men that are lonely, they're looking for, companionship. A lot of foreign nationals, if they don't speak our language, they don't really know how to, have a time with a woman. So we run into all kinds of situations, but I would say right now, that's the one that has me the most concerned, which is the normalization of this in our culture today. And I'm sure all of us keep talking about that, but that just bothers me from whatever industries are pushing it. Again, that's the thing that bothers me, and some of the hypocrisy of different organizations that talk about, not wanting to objectify women in, whatever it is, TV ads or different environments, and it just plays with the psyche and in that entitlement that men feel to not respect an individual and understand about consensual relationships. So that's what I see right now, at least one of the main drivers. So.
Sounds like you guys are all seeing the decriminalization push creating more of a problem. And it's interesting, Michael, you said that it's probably 50-50 now, people that would vote for it, vote against it. I didn't realize it had gotten so even. Okay, the next question, how do you think that we would be the most effective in framing the issue of demand? Is there a specific model that is just generally accepted? Or what's your consensus among the three of you?
Are we going to kind of go in the same order? Is that what you
Sure,
would like to do?
Sure, either way.
Well, when I've spoken about this or when I get a chance to speak to a legislative staffer or a community group, and you're trying to get people to, think about it and take it seriously, the one thing that I've learned through a lot of years of doing this is that, if you're talking to people that aren't really involved in this in any way, right? They're not advocates, they're not survivors, they're not law enforcement, but they're just like people trying to lead a normal life. It's very easy for them to fall into what the cultural stereotypes are and just assume it's true, which is that for the most part, it's probably just kind of a harmless thing. It's old blue laws that, and well, of course, if they're kids, of course they're for us, that's a bad thing, but that's probably pretty rare, right? So so to try to get them to take it seriously, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done that's really just simply education, and just try to throw as many facts as we can at them. But then if you do get someone that actually cares about it, and they think, well, this is a problem, prostitution's a problem, and it's, darker, more serious cousin, sex trafficking, they're bad things. So how do we get on top of it? And I think most people instinctively gravitate towards looking at the traffickers as the evil ones, right? The horns of pitchfork, they're the ones that are doing the getting the money and forcing them into it and things like that. And then the other thing that people gravitate towards is the victims and survivors, and thank goodness for that, right? Of course, people should have empathy. We should do more than we're doing and all that. But the thing that gets left out, and I think for most people, this is kind of intuitively, it just happens. The buyers aren't seen as the real problem. A lot of them actually get framed in a lot of discussions as if they're just another type of victim. They're being duped by the industry. And what Peter said, it makes a lot of sense, where if you have a primitive and horrible sort of mindset about what men and women are and gender roles, and you think, well, the guys that buy sex are the victims of the fallen women who are enticing them, or they're kind of the victims of the traffickers or the industry itself that are just kind of playing on their weakness. So they're kind of seen as just marks, right? In a confidence game, victims of circumstance, victims of the industry or something. And I think that's why the accountability language that Peter has been pushing in particular, probably before most people were, is super important. And I think is a logical exercise. This is something like, if I have an elevator speech, right, you got like 90 seconds with someone, what do you say to them? I often will start with a question and say, explain to me how sex trafficking is possible if there are no buyers. Just tell me, explain it to me. And I've asked that question in front of hundreds of people. I've never once got an answer, and people don't even really try to answer it because the answer is so obvious. That you could have someone that wants to pimp, you can have someone that wants to be sold or whatever, and it just cannot happen without buyers. So then the other question I've asked is, what would happen, do you think, if we had all the buyers out there still looking at the rates they are right now, but you rescued every single victim? They were just gone, all protected, all extracted. What do you think would happen? And they would kind of, well, pretty soon you're going to get a new batch, right? Because the market is there, the financial incentive. The same thing with the traffickers, which is you could arrest every trafficker, gone. We got every one of those guys gone. There's a stream of money, and people are just going to look at an open spot in the bank and just grab a net, So I think that for me, going back to basics, very simple concepts, trying to just say, look, this is not possible. All of these horrific things, and every survivor story that keeps you up at night and makes you weep, that none of them are possible without the buyers. So we have to do something about them. And the other thing I try to get across is that this is not a zero-sum game. A lot of times when you start pushing to do more about demand, you get a little pushback from the survivor advocate community sometimes, which is, wait, more for them means less for us. Not all of them do. I mean, a lot of people get it and don't push back, but you do get that. And also from law enforcement, sometimes they'll say, wait a second, we still have to go after the pimps and traffickers. So I think it's really important to understand that as long as it's done right, and many communities have done this and shown it can work, you actually gain resources if you go after the buyers. For one, if you can close the service gap it's pretty hard to do just by dumping more resources into more shelters, right? You know, if you doubled the size of all this service provision right now, you would probably go from serving 5% to 10%, right? But if you can actually drop the market activity, you know, and the need for people to be abused, you can close the gap. And the other thing is that one thing these guys demonstrate is they have disposable income. And a lot of these programs have a restorative justice type of element to them where the money they get sustains all of the direct interventions, plus it also provides resources for survivor programs. And there are many examples of it. The numbers got big in San Francisco simply because they processed so many men. They had over 7,000 men go through. And they generated over $3 million, and a third of that went to survivor programs. So, you know, that was kind of found money. It was not out of taxpayer budgets. It was not out of police department budgets. It was from the people that create the problem. So those are things like it can be revenue positive. It can be low burden, low risk to taxpayers. There's a lot of evidence that these things can work. Going after demand can work. And the other thing is it's absolutely essential. You are not going to get ahead of this problem by ignoring it. It has to be not the only thing, but you have to do demand reduction if you have any hope of actually preventing and lowering the scope of the problem. So that's my rant. I will leave. I will hand it off to whoever.
Well, I'll jump in. I agree with all of that. And I think it's also always stands out to me that in some ways, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the way that it was written to address only severe forms of trafficking and then defining those, if it's an adult, as requiring force, fraud, and coercion, identifies the wrongness, the badness that's happening as happening by the trafficker. And so many times when people look at demand, they're having to make these convoluted arguments. Well, demand is problematic because it causes third-party exploitation and trafficking, which is the real problem. And I think while that is a real problem and inseparable from the issue of demand, demand is also a problem because it's a problem, because the demand for sexual access to the bodies of other people in exchange for money is an abuse of power. And it exists on a continuum of sexual assault. It's not consensual, it's not mutual. It's an act of violence against another person. It's exploitation and violence. The exploitation is not just by the pimp. The purchaser is exploiting, whether it's on one end of the continuum, the Green River Killer, or the other guy who goes ahead and has sex with a dissociative person who's just trying to get through this act with him so she can get some money, right? Quid pro quo sexual harassment, as Nick called it out a few minutes ago. I think that we need to look at the demand as a problem in and of itself, not only in its relationship to trafficking, which again is inseparable. But I think that I guess this really stands out to me because I've known so many men that I've worked with over the year use the third party as an accountability dodge. You know, they come into the class, oh, I wasn't aware that there were all these bad pimps out there doing these terrible things to women. And of course, I'm not going to participate anymore in that. And I'm always, quick to say, well, that's not quite accountability on your part. Why don't we look at, why do so many men want to have sex with people who don't want to have sex with us? And think that that's okay. And then take a look at being accountable for treating another person as an object, for dehumanizing them, and for exerting our will over them in ways where they did not have substantive choice in the situation. Like that to me is like the key part of where I think a lot of demand reduction frameworks go wrong, is that they don't really look at the act of paying for sex itself as problematic. And it causes all the downstream harm, but in and of itself, it's a harmful act to do to another person. And accountability requires that you kind of own that, right? And that you make some changes to your own behavior and you make it up to that other person in those ways. And so, you know, part of the reason that I started working on intervention programming was just because of the transformative or restorative justice aspect of it, because I think that that's so key. When it's done well, it's a value add. It doesn't take away from survivor services. And what it does is it really kind of comes alongside, allied with the efforts of those who are advocating for justice for survivors. And it adds a whole kind of like level of holistic sort of holistically addressing the problem, right? That can be very complementary to the work that's being done in providing exit programming. And you know, it also, I think, is essential that they're linked up with the advocates and exit programming, because it's helpful for survivors and their advocates to kind of know that this work is happening and really holding those who are responsible to account for the harm that happens. I mean, I remember years ago, I was leaving the ops office where we did our survivor service in order to go teach a class to the men in the evening. And as I'm going, one of our participants, an formerly exploited person, grabbed me and said, "Hey, Peter, do you have any brochures for that men's class of yours?" And I said, "Well, why? Why do you want one?" And she said, "Well, you know, the guy I've been getting pretty close to in my building. Well, the other day I thought I'd invite him up for some tea and we were talking. I thought I'd take a chance and tell him about what happened to me and what I used to do." And so I did. And then he looked at me and said, "How much for a blowjob?" And I looked him square in the eyes and I said, "You know, you've got a problem and there's a class for guys like you. And so I want a brochure so I can go and bring it and stuff it under his door." And to me, that was like the biggest compliment that I could ever get, because rather than blame herself, rather than her go into that situation, come out of that situation and say, "What's wrong with me? Why do these guys always pick on me? Why am I always in this situation?" She was like, "No, you're the guy with the problem. You need the help." It's the classic example of somebody else's problem becoming your problem, right? That this is the problem of the buyer that becomes amplified and projected onto the bodies of people in prostitution, and it becomes their problem. But if we're going to address the root is demand. And not because it causes trafficking, but because demand itself is problematic. So if I had to put a framework out there about how we address demand, that would be essential to it, is that demand itself is the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I was thinking it when I was in the business world, whatever product we were trying to sell, we tried to create a demand. We did that by marketing. And so, yes, the culture is marketing through whatever messages they are. But when that person makes a decision to come in and buy the product, they made the decision to come in and buy the product. And that's why I appreciate this conversation about accountability, because yes, again, to underline it, there's no demand for iPhones, you know, smartphones, whatever computers, they're just going to sit on a shelf. And we would see that sometimes, you know, there was no demand for something. So, but the decision, again, to underline is accountability. That's why I appreciate everything that's being said, because one thing we do try to do when we're doing these cyber patrols is, yes, we're acting as a decoy, as law enforcement is, and we know our parameters, we know what entrapment is and what it isn't. But when they start approaching us, you know, for, you know, costs and how much it's going to cost, we do send back this information, at least to start the conversation. As your information is being recorded, it can be shared with law enforcement. I have some things I need you to know. And that type of accountability, I think, is key, because I can't treat this, as everyone else is saying, as if somebody's just trying to steal a paperclip at work, you know, a minor infraction. This is not something small. This is a crime against humanity. And again, creating that understanding that this is a big step. You've decided to take this other individual, pay for them, and do whatever you want with them. The accountability of that is key. And when we can have that kind of conversation where, you know, risk aversion, let's say, is one of the biggest things that gets men to the fear of being arrested, the self-preservation mode. If we can crack that a little bit, we have a pretty interesting conversation with that individual if they can really understand what they've done. But if we treat it like it's not a big thing, I mean, the examples of, genocide, Adolf Hitler, whatever you want to use, when another person is just an object from my philosophy or whatever of life, I can do what I want. So that's just something I really appreciate that's being spoken of here, is the accountability piece of letting them know, you could be arrested, and what you're doing is not a minor infraction. What Peter was saying too about, if it's horrific and all these different things that, happen during the act. And I have run into that with men where they just, and I'm, doing even presentations about this. They'll say, well, what if the woman just wants this? And, we just say, well, look, it's still against the law. Do you understand that? We understand there's a missing piece there. Like we're all saying, this is a huge understanding of accountability as men, that we need to understand of how to treat that other individual. And I will say this, I was blessed to have a very respectful father of my mother, and he made sure we respected, carrying the groceries, we were Italian Catholic family, so he was very, boisterous. Pick up those, pick that up, do that, help your mother, and that kind of thing. And I think, again, the modeling of that is so key. I will say this, I've got 3 sons, and my wife used to laugh at me when I go through these long lectures to them, about what to do. And she said, you probably need to stop after they get really glassy-eyed, they're not listening anymore. But the one thing I've seen now that they're grown men, and I'm very happy to say, is I see they followed my example more than the lectures. And I think as men, the more we model this in our everyday lives is so key, and can generate conversations of, that we respect. My wife is in this battle with me. I respect her. She's a lot smarter in a lot of things than I am. And so we co-equal, we work together in this. And again, modeling that, so that if a man knows he's crossed that line of accountability and he's treated that other person in an immoral fashion, or something that is not the way we should be working together as a culture, the accountability needs to be there. So again, I just really thank you guys for bringing that up, because I think sometimes it's really missing, where this is not treated the way it is. And again, we don't condemn. If we can crack that, we have a conversation of intelligence and compassion, try to help them out, walk them through it. But to me, that is key. And so, yeah, I guess I'm underlining a lot of what's been said, but I really agree with my panelists here.
Yeah, I think on the.
Do you mind if I jump back in again?
No, go ahead.
Something I feel like it just needs to be said, and I feel like I should have said it the first time around. I think a big part of any framework needs to integrate input from survivors. Anything, and I think that the 3 of us that are on the panel, it's kind of like always there, so we haven't really necessarily said it, like our understanding of the problem and solutions and all that. We've been in, I know most of the important things that I know about this topic have been taught to me by survivors. And they need to be, I think a big part of like the male accountability is listening. We want the buyers to listen, and we need to model that too. And by we, I mean any group, any community. If you have, a task force, if you have a community organization, a church, listening's got to be part of it. The communities are different, the infrastructure is different. A program that works perfectly fine in Portland or San Francisco or Minneapolis may not work in Tallahassee or somewhere else. The delivery of the program. So, there is an element of, frameworks are good, but you still end up having to build it over and over every time, and Peter and Nick, I think they have a lot of experience working with a lot of different places. And you see that, but that listen to survivors has kind of become a slogan, and you can see where sometimes it's probably not being done well. It's sort of like, well, let's figure something out and bring them in there and see if they certify what we've come up with, right? Or sometimes they're being asked to roll up their sleeves and pitch in and help do something, but they don't get compensated for it. They get kind of exploited as survivor leaders or experts. So there's a lot to it. I don't want to just throw it out there and say, listen to survivors, as a throwaway line. I mean that if we're talking about a framework, any framework needs somehow in a meaningful way that is not an exploitation exercise or just simply a rubber stamp or to say you did it, but in a meaningful way, they need to have input because every program is different, every environment is different, and they are critical. And by the way, they often are far and away the most important speakers. All these John's intervention programs that I've studied and looked at and sat through, I bet you that 90% of what they remember 10 years down the road are what the survivors said. You can just see the whole vibe is different in these classes and these interventions. They're listening in a far different way to them than they do to anyone else. So it's not only the right thing to do, but they also are extremely effective, or they can be. So anyway.
Thank you so much for bringing that up and pointing that out. I think if we are not listening to survivors, those with lived experience, then we're really just spinning our wheels. We have to listen to those experts. Peter, you came off mute. Did you want to say something? Okay.
I did. I think that the thing that Nick just said, and then the thing that Michael followed with, those things together, for me, accountability to survivors is part of what we need to figure out when we're doing demand reduction, and how do we really figure out how to do that in practice, right? Because it can happen in a lot of different ways. So the listening part is key, and the not forgetting. I think that my introduction to accountability work, and I'm talking about social justice accountability, the way that we conceptualize it, not a law enforcement or necessarily other ways that we might frame accountability, but accountable to those who have less power, right? How do I find myself how do I account for my privilege with those who have less power, understanding that my privileges me with blind spots, right? And so I need to listen to those who have identities that are target identities, that are less privileged identities, in order for me to understanding what I'm not seeing. It's like the time I was driving in Seattle and a friend of mine who was Black was driving behind me. When we got to our destination, he said, "Peter, you should get that taillight fixed, your taillight's out." Then he saw me again 2 weeks later and said, "Peter, you're so white." To me, I said, thank you. I'll get that. And then put in my head, I'm going to go get my taillight fixed. And, but being a white guy, I thought, and if the cop pulls me over, I'll tell him, "Oh, thank you, officer. I'll take the fix-it ticket and then get my taillight fixed." But my friend driving behind me had an entirely different understanding of what it meant to drive without a taillight. And so I think as men, we're driving without taillights a hell of a lot of the time. And that we need to listen to women, and specifically around issues of commercial sexual exploitation, we need to listen to survivors of commercial sexual exploitation. They're the ones who know better than any of us about what this harm is. And so I just wanted to link. I would love to talk about this for even longer, but I just wanted to link those ideas that accountability for me that's worth having is accountability to survivors. And I would love it if our coordinated responses as a whole, which I think is what Michael was getting at, were accountable to survivors. And I think we need to think really hard about what that is, because survivors are people, and they're different people, and they have different opinions on different things. And so it's not an easy task. It's not like there's a memo from the survivor organization that can stamp you as accountable and this guy's okay. It's a process. It's a process of aligning yourself and explaining yourself, not necessarily always agreeing, but always kind of like being willing to talk and explain what you're doing and why you're doing it, and make sure that it's not doing any harm, and that you recognize that we've all got these big blind spots that we can take a look at, right? And that it's the reasons to do so are the same reasons that Batter's intervention had to make so many changes in the 80s. Because you get into a room with a bunch of sex buyers without survivors, if they're not speaking at that particular session, and suddenly you're seeing things through their eyes and from their perspective. And I used to talk to our facilitators that facilitating this class is about walking the razor's edge between compassion for those that you're working with and accountability to those that they've hurt. Because we know that hurt people, right? But hurt people can also help people. And so we can kind of engage them in this process, not judging them for what they've done, not judging them for who they are, but judging what they've done, and then being able to kind of walk them into better ways of being. And I think that the key operating principle there, and I'm glad Michael brought it up, and I'm glad Nick talked about accountability too, is accountability to survivors, that's crucial throughout the movement.
Yeah, if I could just, obviously you've hit a chord with all of us, but just knowing the survivors, and I bring up Rebecca Bender, she's, well known in this field, and we've been good friends, and I helped her get her org started years ago. And so got to know her really well, and just listening to her stories helped us develop our script. So our script was developed in part with survivors. What do you want to tell these men? Because again, it like everyone was saying, it's foolish to think we'd understand, at all what they were going through at that time. But Rebecca would always tell me something. She has such a unique perspective that people would come up to her and just say, "How do you not hate men? How do you not despise them?" And her answers were, diverse, but it was somehow she had the ability to see some humanity in all of these situations. Not every one of them. There were those that were obviously on the far end of the psychopath world, I'll call it. But there were those that did have understanding and conversations. And again, that's what gave us the ability to really understand and to tell guys, lay your baseball bat at the door. We're not here to, we're not law enforcement. We don't take them down, or anything, but we want to have a mindset to get into their mind. And without that understanding that Rebecca and some other survivors that I've known throughout the years, it would really be impossible to understand, because we're guys and we just don't understand, being abused like that or used like that. So, yeah, I like what you said, the accountability to the survivors, because that's why we can't treat this as just a normal thing, because I feel that accountability to all these individuals that I've known throughout the years that did go through this victimization. So
I don't know if you guys have had the same experience, but over the years, I found that people that have the most empathy towards the buyers tend to be survivors. Like I can get a little Old Testament about it sometimes. It's just like, they're the problem, smack them down, right? Like get control of them, out them, hold them accountable. Sometimes to me is punishment if I don't try to be empathetic, and it's usually the survivors I've known have said over and over and over that most of them aren't bad guys, but they are doing bad things. And most of them weren't trying to hurt me, but they all did, but that isn't what they were trying to do. What they're doing is horrible, but, there's a numbers game where, that kind of can be a little confusing, almost seem like a dilemma. You get survivors and then you get therapists that will basically say it's probably the 10% that are really the abusive, horrible guys that everyone is scared of, right? And most of the other guys are not that, that way. But the problem is the numbers, that if 1 out of 10 guys is violent, and you're with 5 guys a day, you're running into them over and over and over again. But that doesn't mean just because you experience a lot of violence from the population that they're all that way. And again, it's just one of those other examples where the survivors kind of walked me through it and got me to understand it. And they usually are the ones that are most adamant about not vilifying all of them as just horrible, irredeemable people. they're the ones that have been leading the charge, I think, on having some empathy.
I think
All
the
right, go ahead. I've probably been distracting you from your.
No. I mean, Michael, what you just said got me is about, the majority of these, or whatever percentage, are not bad guys. The demand abolition report on buyers said 70% of buyers said they quit because it was inconsistent with their morals. And I remember the first time I read it, it's kind of like they got morals, come on, but I will say this anecdotally, our conversations with these guys, it'll start off as, one was a guy, yeah, babe, I'll take care of you. And he sends this emoji of all this money flying. And, so then I hit him with, your information is being recorded and so on. And he goes, well, I'm not trying to buy anybody. Of course, they always duck down and hide. And I just said, well, do you know these women are being forced against their will? And he goes, no, but I still wasn't trying to buy. And so then I just said, do you have daughters and sisters and stuff? Would you like to see this happen to them over and over again? And then he started to soften, and we had a really good conversation. And he admitted, he said, I am lonely. I'm a soldier. I'm just back for a short period of time. And I just said, look, if you are arrested, your life will change overnight. Kind of gave him some of the laws and understanding. And again, that these women are not doing this consensually, I won't go through the whole thing, but at the end, he said something interesting. He said, thank you so much. He said, I feel oddly relieved that you got in my way tonight. And those, again, that lets me know that there are guys that do have morals, but it's like a hostage situation. They've done something stupid, and now we got to talk them back over the line. So anyway, yeah, just to underline that we do have the opportunity to understand that there are some guys out there that will listen.
As you guys have emphasized, you can't lump buyers together in a homogeneous group. They're on a continuum. So my next question to you is it possible to create a statewide large-scale program that's capable of assessing whether a buyer might simply be in need of a talk like Nick gave, or some education, or if they're actually might have a pathology and need a mental health professional on a large scale or statewide? Is it possible? And as a follow-up part of that question, would using a sex offender risk assessment be appropriate?
I will nominate Peter to start this. I think he's in the best position.
Sex buying is a social practice, and a lot of times we look at it happening by individuals. I think, and so if we're looking at these individuals as the problem, we might want to look to a statewide attempt to kind of figure out how to fix this problem. And in certain respects, some are more dangerous than others, and some sort of risk assessment might be great, but I wouldn't look to that as a magic bullet or a way that we were going to stop demand, because demand is enormous, and it's cultural, and it's societal. And, in Seattle, we were, or King County, we were putting 200 men a year or so through the class, the 10-week class. And when we did some research with Arizona State University, quite a while back now, but I'm sure the numbers are pretty consistent. We were looking at more than 6,000 men a day trying to contact ads on just one individual website that was working at that time. So we're not going to arrest our way out of it, and we're not going to figure like looking at it like, well, we need to fix this minuscule percentage of the men that are out there buying sex by developing this national or this statewide protocol in order to figure out which program to funnel them to. It's definitely a worthwhile endeavor, worth taking a look at, but it needs to be happening in concert with prevention work that's happening all along a continuum of prevention along the lifespan, and the social norms change work as well, and the work, providing exit programming for youth and adults that's survivor-centered and preferably survivor-led. Yeah, so like all of those pieces have to work together. And so, yes, well, I think that it would be great to be able to identify different modes of programming that would be better suited for dependent on the level of risk that we saw that these men pose to their communities. That might be a worthwhile endeavor. But I hazard to jump in there, and I say this as a guy that's created sex buying intervention programs. That when communities talk to me and say, you know, we would like to do a sex buyers intervention program, I ask them about everything else because I think it's important to think about it all together. What are you doing on prevention? You know, what are we, because if we're looking at prevention work as an inverted pyramid, right, and we're looking at primary, secondary, and tertiary forms of prevention, primary prevention being, you know, really nipping it in the bud way before something like this happens. Secondary, when somebody's at risk for committing something, we prevent that. And lastly is like that tertiary form of prevention, prevent it from happening again. You know, I would put way less effort into tertiary forms of prevention and load more into the primary and secondary modes of prevention in terms of men's engagement work. And I would look specifically to linking up the work that's being done to prevent other forms of gender-based violence, like dating violence, sexual harassment, and sexual assault, with commercial sexual exploitation. So that when somebody's high school or middle school is doing their programming around those other forms of gender-based violence, that this is integrated into it, and that healthy sexuality and healthy relationships are talked about together, right? So I guess the answer is I think that it would be useful to deal with this in a statewide level. And it would be useful to help people understand what sex buying is and how it operates. In terms of kind of actually stopping commercial sexual exploitation, it will be useful in that it was integrated in with a coordinated response that was doing all the things to change social norms while we were providing opportunities for survivors to exit and for men to kind of find accountability. So yes, it's useful. No, it alone is not going to move the needle very far.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Peter was saying. The other thing is there are some real practical issues that would have to be dealt with, you know, in trying to implement something like that. So there's an unfortunate reality in 49 of the 50 states, which is buying sex from an adult is misclassified as a misdemeanor. You know, it shouldn't be. It's a far more serious thing that they're doing, but that's what it is on the books. And anytime you try to establish an intervention, it needs to, is triggered by a law enforcement action, by an arrest. So for sex buyers, you know, there's self-referrals and other things, but for the most part, we're talking about you arrest them and then what? And then, well, we should put them into some sort of programming. Ideally, yes, there would be a risk needs assessment. That would be terrific to figure out what their issues are. But the problem is these are misdemeanors in the system. So how much programming are you going to have for all of these misdemeanor cases? And it's one thing to just say, oh, what, you got arrested for this? Go see Peter. He's got a great program for you, right? That works, right? Because you just funnel them all there, and he, you know, is actually doing his own risk needs assessments in the interactions. He's kind of thinking, oh, you're that guy, you got this problem, you're, you know, he's sort of figuring it out and trying to customize a response, right? I think it would probably capsize under its own weight to take a risk needs assessment and try to apply it to every guy that got arrested for trying to buy sex from an adult. And then the other thing is, if you're going to do a risk needs assessment, one of the reasons is you're going to treat them differently. Well, how many different program modalities are you going to have set up for sex buyers? And it's a big enough challenge just trying to get one. But if you're going to have 3 or 4 or 5 different modalities based on your risk needs assessment, I think the thing would probably collapse under its own weight. You know, there's kind of top heavy on the assessment part, and you don't have the programming on the other end of it. Yeah, so that's, that's just a consideration. But I do think there is one distinction, and I think we probably should have said something about it earlier. Something that's changed in the 15 years I've been tracking what demand reduction interventions are happening throughout the United States. And we've documented something in almost 2,600 communities now, cities and counties. And the one thing that's changed over the last 5-7 years is that a much higher percentage of the arrested sex buyers now were arrested for trying to buy access to sexually abuse a child. And one of the reasons that is happening is because for the first 40 years of sting operations, they would put a woman on the street and they would get approached, and they could try to say, well, she was pretending she was 16 or something like that, but it's easily defended in court. You can say, look, I don't care what she said. That was a 31-year-old policewoman. That's what my client responded to. But the thing now with having web-based stings where you have an ad online, you can have these conversations where it's made very, very clear this person that, it's fictional, this person that you're going to show up to the hotel to try to buy is a minor. And they can put the evidence together. So now I think there's a real big distinction there that we can, I think, at least have two big groups in terms of the intervention on the other end. One is for the person that was a misdemeanor trying to buy an adult versus someone trying to buy access to sexually abuse a child. And a lot of the sort of interventions we talk about really aren't suitable for someone trying to buy a child, and some of them, depending on how young and depending on the other elements of the case, you're really talking about sex offender treatment modality is where they need to go. And, they're not going to take a one-day John School class, listen to something, and then be free, right? That's not appropriate and it wouldn't work. But, so for the children, someone to buy children, that's a newer thing. The last 5-10 years that's something we need to actually think about as we talk about what do we do with the buyers. Well, we got two different classes that are very different, at least legally and in terms of what we can do. I mean, you actually could put a risk needs assessment and get a whole protocol if what you have is felony arrest and people that would be serving time, and you actually could have, residential treatment or, like long-term treatment protocols. Again, I'll turn over the other guys to elaborate or respond to that, but
I was just going to say real quick. Oh, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say real quick, just to underline what we do see here in Mesa, Arizona, and Phoenix. We do work with law enforcement or share information back and forth. And as far as those who are buying underage kids, does seem to be, I want to say, on the increase. We've actually had those on our cyber patrols too, where guys are asking us how old we are. And, we're able to get information on a 63-year-old man that wanted to have, sex with what he thought was a 15, 16-year-old girl. We forward that information on and, they take it from there. But I do see, that happening. And again, when kind of sway this too back, I think, towards Peter a little bit is, statewide work, again, needs to be so much prevention and getting to the youth. And I know Peter, does a lot of work with kids in classrooms because, there's the potential pimps and buyers right there, and those that could be victimized from anything from A to Z. So I think just getting to the youth is so key because, again, of what we're seeing a little bit of upswing with those that are looking for underage people.
Yeah, just a couple quick comments to add on to what Michael was saying. In King County, there were stings that were being done. We did have participants in our sex buyers class who were caught in stings for youth, right? The detective would say, I'm 15 years old, do you still want to meet? And so that was a felony. Like it was, they would plead out to communicating with minor, commercial sexual exploitation of a minor. Communicating with a minor for immoral purposes was what they would plead out to. And then they would get sent to sex offender treatment for an evaluation, right? And if they were evaluated as deviant, they would get sent to sex offender treatment. If they were found non-deviant, they would come to the SSE program. What we found was fascinating in the first couple of years of getting those men in the class. First of all, I was wondering what was going to happen to the dynamics in the classroom, right? Was it going to be a situation where the buyers of adults would say, I'm not as bad as that guy, I didn't try to buy a kid, like, or have antagonism towards the other people? That didn't happen at all. Like, that didn't happen at all, which to me spoke volumes about the good girl, bad girl dichotomy, right? Because they were all prostitutes to them. It doesn't matter like how old they are. They're there by choice, de facto because of their identities as prostitutes. The other thing that was really interesting is about a year and a half after we were doing the program, I got invited to speak at the Sex Offender Treatment Provider Conference for statewide in Washington. And when I got out there, I thought it was going to be a room that was really very supportive of the work that I was doing, and that they were very allied with it, would be very allied with me. And so I gave my spiel, and somebody stood up at the end of it and said, what, I don't know what the hell you people are doing, but you're arresting all the wrong guys. All these guys are assessing as non-deviant. So the vast majority of these men who were taking this deviancy assessment, trying to buy sex from a 15-year-old exploited person, were not pedophiles, were not identified as deviant, but in fact, and the sex offender treatment provider community, with significant exceptions, was pissed off that they suddenly had to do with all these assessments that weren't the right guys, because there are those right harmful guys out there. This guy was just trying to buy sex from a 15-year-old prostitute, right? Which speaks volumes about how we need to do some education work in the sex offender treatment provider communities around kind of the harms of commercial sexual exploitation. And it also, says what is a risk assessment going to entail? Like, if we even get to do it eventually, what is it going to look like? Is it going to look like this deviancy assessment, which obviously was letting a lot of people through the cracks, right? So I think that there's so much to talk about in this question, and I think that it's a good question to ask, and that it gives us the opportunity to kind of point in directions like, this is another thing that you can think about. And we're obviously not going to get to the bottom of it here, but I think that there's a lot of issues that we can explore that are rooted in this question of buying from kids versus or youth or adults, and then identifying kind of more harmful and less harmful buyers. It's really nuanced and fraught with potential issues. So thank you all. I'm glad to get a chance to dig into a little bit.
All right, we are coming up on time. It's 3:25. I do have one for each of you for about a minute and a half. Talk to us about what are potentially harmful strategies or like language we need to avoid, something that could hinder our efforts.
You want to start, Nick?
Sure. For us that are dealing with the buyers, again, harmful languages is we don't look to condemn them. We're not trying to ramrod something down their throats. We're trying to be really careful, again, and just stating the facts, not letting our emotions, carry us away. And again, not acting as if this is no big deal. Because again, we talked about accountability. My friendship with victims would go out the door. I can't treat this as if this is nothing. So it's kind of twofold. We can't be so soft. I don't know how else to say it. But we need to let them know they've crossed the line. It's a major line, but we're not going to, try to condemn them, but we want to try to pull them through to some rationale and some understanding of what is really going on. So.
I think that when I'm talking, especially with men who are engaging other men in doing this work, that an important thing to do for us to remember, and a mistake that I see getting made, is we need to be engaged in our own process of looking at shedding light on our own blind spots and recognizing, not separating ourselves so much with the buyer, right? That you don't, we're not going to get far. We're going to make a lot of mistakes if this becomes about us good, noble, pro-feminist, wonderful men out there who are helping, versus these horrible, reprehensible folks who are clueless and need our help, need us to shed the light. I'm a work in progress. I've got my own blind spots. If my wife was here, she would reinforce that to you. I remember we had an argument one time, and she said to me, "I'm going to follow you around to all those trainings you do, Peter, and tell everybody what a hypocrite you are." And it was funny, but it was also true, because I'm engaged in this continual process of accountability, right? That I practice in my communities, that I practice with survivors, that I practice with the people in my lives, with my friends, and recognizing that that's important for me to do. Whenever anybody used to come up to me at a training or a presentation I was doing and say, "I want to help fight trafficking," I would say, come through the class as a participant, and then come through, see if you want to facilitate it. But there's a lot that we still have to learn before we can try to help others about kind of ourselves and where our own blind spots are around this. So that's what I would say. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think if our priority is effectiveness and connecting and digging in and making change, sometimes we have to get over ourselves a little bit in our use of language. Like we, as a movement, not to speak for anyone else, but we think hard about how to say things. We don't want to call it sex work for a lot of very good reasons. We want to talk about survivors. We don't want to just say prostitute as as if it's a master status or pejorative. And so we talk amongst ourselves a lot, but sometimes that can actually come back to bite us a bit when we're digging into a community and trying to get them to do something or trying to help them do something. I know a lot of police officers who are absolutely terrific and trying to do the right things. And sometimes I'm wincing because I'm hearing the language they're using. They'll say hookers or something, and I hate it. I don't like it. And sometimes the survivors themselves, especially women that are not out of it yet, they're still in the middle of it. They say a lot of things in the way I wouldn't say it. And I think one way to really mess things up is to start correcting people, to go into a community and say, look, I'm the expert, I'm enlightened, and you start correcting the police, you start correcting the survivors, and I think especially with survivors, let them talk about their own experience, their own life, their own views in the way they want to. We don't have to adopt that language, but don't, I think it can really, if we get dogmatic and precious about our own little opinions, that can really separate us, and it can derail real change. So sometimes I think we have to kind of tolerate imperfect language that we don't prefer, to just connect and to move forward on the more important issue of just getting stuff done. That's just a thought about language that you probably had nothing to do with the question you asked, but I said it anyway.
No, that's exactly what we were looking for. Yeah, thank you. All right, gentlemen, that is our time. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. You've all had years of experience and so much insight, and we appreciate you taking the time and sharing that with us today. For the attendees who want more information about the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force, or if you want to participate, I've put the link in the chat, but it is ncdemandreduction.com. So thank you guys all for attending, and have a great day.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Nikki, you want to stop the recording?
Mm.
Can you hear